Okay, and we are recording.
All right, thank you very much. Welcome to the June 23rd, 2025 meeting of the Committee of the Whole of the Tennessee Public Charter School Commission. A link has been provided on the Commission website for the public to view this meeting. Today, the committee will hear a presentation from our Executive Director, Tess Stovall, General Counsel Ashley Thomas, Director of Authorizing Beth Figueroa, and Director of External Affairs Hayden Pendergrass on Public Chapter 275 of 2025, which takes effect on July 1 and makes several changes to the Charter School Act. I look forward to a robust discussion with commissioners on this new legislation to ensure we are prepared for these changes, and we will continue to set a high standard for all charter school authorizers in the state. We will not be taking any votes today, and any potential rule or policy changes will be presented at our July meeting. Are there any comments from any commissioners before we get started? Okay, seeing none, I'll now recognize Tess to give us an overview of our discussion today.
Thank you, Chair Richards, and good morning. We are thrilled to have this discussion this morning with the Commission to really ground you all in what Public Chapter 275 does, and then the implications that it will have on the Commission. As Chair Richards said, this will be a discussion-based meeting with no votes, but information that we collect from you all as commissioners will inform the rules and policies that we bring at our July meeting. We are going to start where Hayden is going to give us an overview of Public Chapter 275 and all of the components within it. Then we are going to move to an overview of the New Start application process from Beth. We know that you all are intimately familiar with the appeal process, but with this new legislation, we may be responsible for New Start applications prior to an appeal. And so we want to have you all understand what that process is from statute and from rule. And then finally, we will end with Ashley facilitating a discussion on some items that we would like your feedback on as we prepare for July. At the end of each section, we will pause for questions and discussion so that we can make sure that everyone understands that section before we move forward. We do have a hard stop at 11 a.m. Central, 12 p.m. Eastern. So I wanted to let you all know that now in case we have to move the discussion forward and follow up with anyone after the meeting. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Hayden, who's going to begin the discussion on Public Chapter 275.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Glad to see you all. I know we had a pretty robust discussion of this legislation back in our March meeting, but as it was still in the process and there were a tweak or two made, but through amendment towards the end, I just want to run back through and make sure everyone understands what the final bill did and kind of where we stand. So Public Chapter 275 will take effect July 1, and it kind of did 5 main things. First off, it made gave y'all additional flexibility in the length of renewal appeal terms. We did a lot of streamlining of document development and reporting, shifting a lot of those responsibilities from the department and then over to either the State Board of Education or the Commission. And then it added 3 new pathways for applications to follow under the Charter Schools Act. So to add a little more details to each of these sections, on the next slide, first off, we've for the last couple of years, the commissioners have discussed adding some additional flexibility, especially for renewal appeal terms. Currently under the law, all charter school terms, regardless of the type of application or type of decision you're making, were required to be 10 years. A lot of times through the renewal appeal process, we felt that certain applications deserved a little additional flexibility. So now for renewal appeals, just for renewal appeals, so this would be a situation where a school under a local LEA is applying for renewal. is denied at the local level and has then appealed to the commission, you'll now be able to make a decision on where to set that charter term to between 5 and 10 years. So any length of time that y'all deem as appropriate between 5 and 10 years will be available to you for renewal appeals specifically. We haven't received a ton of renewal appeals in the past, but this will just add some additional flexibility, and then give us a better idea in terms of, should we look at other options for charter terms as well. All new start terms will still be 10 years, and getting feedback from stakeholders. They were most comfortable there just dealing with financing items for those initial kind of new start applications. The second big piece of the bill was mostly streamlining. We can go back to that last slide. Was streamlining document creation and notifications and posting. So applications and rubrics will now be created by the State Board of Education in consultation with the Commission. We've already been in discussions with the State Board on developing these documents, updating a lot of things that we've been wanting to kind of tackle over the last few years. And because of the way it was set up previously, it was a little more difficult to make those updates. We're hopeful that working with the State Board, we'll be able to make those changes and have a lot more flexibility in creating those applications and rubrics, and kind of all those foundational documents that go into our process. Also, a lot of the documentation that has been filed during the application process in the past has been filed to the department. We've then had to track it down from them or from LEAs. This bill will solve a lot of that. So all letters of intent will come straight to the commission now. All notifications of decisions at the local district now will both have to go to the department and to the commission. We'll be responsible for posting all these things online and keeping those updated. So all of those responsibilities have now been shifted to us. And so that's should solve a lot of our problems in terms of getting those documents in a timely manner during the application process. So the next three pieces of the bill all dealt with new application pathways. So the first and kind of most simple was it added a process for state institutions of higher education to sponsor a charter school. They cannot authorize, but they can apply just as any other governing board could across the state. They can decide whether or not they want to apply directly with the commission or with their local LEA. We thought we'd give them the option, since it's another state agency, that they could apply directly to us as a state agency as well. Or if they have a good relationship with their local LEA, they can apply directly there. It follows the existing New Start application process and timeline, so there won't be any changes there. Otherwise, it just opens up that option to those higher education institutions. The second pathway it created deals with decisions that you all make. So if you overturn a New Start decision from a local district 3 times within a 3 consecutive year period, that would then allow any sponsor of a New Start application in that district to apply directly to the commission for the following 5-year period. So this, like I said, this is geographically based. So if you were to overturn, say, Metro Nashville 3 times in 3 years, any sponsor within that district could then apply directly to the commission for the following 5 years. This is not retrospective, so this only applies to decisions you make after July 1 of this year, when the act takes effect. So your votes in October will be the first votes that count towards this number. And just to add context, I think I mentioned this in March, but as far as your decision history on New Start applications goes, you've overturned Metro Nashville 7 times in the previous 3 cycles, Memphis-Shelby County 3 times in the previous 3 cycles, Jackson-Madison once, and Rutherford once. So just to add some context there to that pathway. But like I said, it's not retrospective. Your October votes will be the first ones to count towards this.
Hey, Hayden, real quick on that one, just a quick question. Because it says if the commission overturns 3 New Start decisions, it doesn't say that we have to overturn the same applicant 3 times. So if we, for instance, overturn 3 in 1 year, does that apply for everyone going forward after that? So it's not by charter entity. It's across all three. Anybody that is an applying in 1 year. If we overturn any one of those three, it applies to everyone going forward. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it applies to any decision you make from that district. So if there are 3 applications from Metro Nashville that get overturned this year, that would go ahead and trigger that, or whatever district those applications come from. It's just each application individually counts towards that total. All right, and then if there are no more questions on that, we'll move
just
on.
A quick question on the sorry, just a quick question on the higher education. If a institution of higher education seeks a charter school, does it still have an independent board of directors? Is the governance independent of the higher education institution? I'm just trying to understand what the relationship would be from a governance standpoint of a charter school, let's say authorized, under at Belmont or Vanderbilt. Is there like a necessary governance control between the university and the charter school, or is it independent and simply sponsored through some sort of contractual relationship? Maybe it's specified in the language.
Hayden, I'm happy to take that, Thomas, because I was actually looking at the New Start application this morning before this meeting. That is actually a question that would be asked of what is the relationship between the governing board of the institution of higher education and then the governing board of the school. Is there a relationship? Is it simply sponsored? Is there a member of the board who sits on each board? So that would have to be articulated within the application about what is the exact relationship. And also, are there certain shared services that would be included as a part of that relationship, or is it more just a spin-off that operates separately and completely from the higher education institution?
Tess?
Yes.
Can you hear me? This is Alan.
Hi,
Alan. Obviously, different states do it differently. I know, for instance, from my experience in Florida, using University of Florida as an example, the PK Young Developmental School, it's somewhat of a charter, but it doesn't have its own board necessarily. It has sort of a board of advisors, but it comes up through the College of Education at the university. So it's ultimately governed by the governing body of the university. And I guess it's done differently in different places. That model has actually worked pretty well. But I would suspect even if there is a board, a governing board of the school, my hunch is that the reserve power for that school will lie with the university president or the board of the university.
And just to add a little more, I think this law doesn't specify any sort of specific relationship that would have to be there. I think in most cases you would have the university appoint some sort of separate board underneath, similar to how the University of Memphis has been with their university school system. They kind of have their own self-contained school administration that's underneath, the University of Memphis as a whole. But the law doesn't specify. I think we could see potentially different applications with different relationships, but they would have to specify kind of how that would all work within the application process.
If you're taking feedback on this, I mean, this is just one opinion. I mean, the models I've seen that I thought were really effective, where you did have the university president appointing or having some mechanism to appoint a board that basically functions as a fiduciary board, but ultimately the reserve power over that board does lie with the university. Because I can't fathom a scenario where we would insist on a university giving up control of its own charter school. But I mean, I guess the question is when we say we're going to inquire about what they're going to do, does it not make sense for us to articulate what our preference is? Because I do think I think governance is important, but I also think it's important for the institution not to give up control of the charter school.
Alan, hey, this is Ashley. I think that's a good feedback point, and I think we'll take note of that. I think, as Hayden mentioned, because the law doesn't specify, there may be something that we can sort of consider in our consideration of any applications we may get. And so that may be something that fleshes out in rule or policy in some way. But as of now, as Hayden mentioned, it's not in the law that specifies what the relationship has to look like for an institute of higher education to sponsor an application.
So Ashley, Hayden, correct me if I'm wrong, this component was only put in there because I'm just going to use Memphis. I think it was University of Memphis. They were seeking to become their own LEA. The legislature said no to that. You can start a charter school, but you have to be under an authorizer, which means you could be either under Shelby County or under us. I mean, kind of bigger scenario. That's really where the genesis of this came from, correct?
Well, the University of Memphis situation is separate. They did get approved for their own what was termed as an innovative school district. So that issue is separate. They aren't seeking to start any charter schools in the discussions we've had with them, but this just kind of opened it up to other state institutions of higher education. This portion of the bill has actually been floating around as a standalone bill for a couple years. I don't recall which state university at the time was interested, but it didn't pass a couple years ago when it was initially filed. The administration included this just as another option if there was a state, college or university that did want to go ahead and start working towards this pathway.
And Tess, when you talk to the University of Tennessee, make sure it's clear whether it's the big UT board or the advisory boards on each campus, since they have that kind of a structure different than the other schools have. So it's just that clear. I would expect it's the big UT board, but I think we need to make sure that we know which one would have that authority.
Because technically, Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, even in the UT, the advisory boards don't have any governing control under the legislature. They only have advisory control.
That is my understanding. Yeah, I think that's correct. Yes, Eddie, that's correct. But I just would, I think it's just for us to make sure that does not come in this issue. I would expect it's the big UT board, but it would just be for clarity for us. Yes.
Well, and guys, and all I'm saying is there's probably a dozen different ways they can approach this. The question is what is our preference? If we're talking about a K-12 charter school, what's the best model from our perspective of governance for that school? It could easily be a parental advisory council. It could be a board that has certain fiduciary delegated authority, but ultimately reports up to the big board, using UT as an example, to the president of the University of Tennessee. I don't really care, because there's probably a bunch of different models that work well. I'm just asking the question, does it make sense for us to provide them guidance on what we want to see versus just coming to us with a bunch of random different ideas, and at that point we're reacting to them instead of outlining what we think a best practice might look like. That's all.
I think that's a good point. The one thing that pops into my head is we may be overlooking some governance models that are innovative and advantageous in a certain context that we simply can't imagine right now. Right. So I think to the extent that we outline principles that we think are important, such as how do you specify accountability, how do you establish the relationship between the board of the university and the board of the institution, like making sure certain things are specified, but leaving some room open for innovative governance models that we simply can't imagine, while preserving some of the principles of accountability and good governance that I think we all want.
That's a great point. That's a great point. Not so much after the how, but what. What we're after is the making sure there's accountability, making sure there's parental involvement, making sure there's a clear line of authority between the institution and the sponsoring institution and the school. I get it. You're 100% right. I agree with that.
Okay, if there aren't further comments, Hayden, let's keep going.
Okay. On to the final pathway that this bill created is what's been termed now in the law as replication. So this is a brand new pathway with a new application and rubric that will be effective July 1. So the application cycle for next year will be the first time this is open as an option. The idea essentially in our discussions with the administration was to allow for existing operators to replicate one of their existing schools in a simpler, more efficient way. So if an operator's had a school open for at least one full school year, they can apply either to the local LEA or directly to the commission for replication. Now, there was some confusion initially related to this, so I want to be clear. If you can only apply for replication within a district where you have already been approved. So you cannot, say an operator in Memphis couldn't use this to replicate into an adjoining county where they haven't received approval yet. So this would not open up any new counties. There were concerns from the legislature related to this. So they would have to be replicating in a county where they've already received approval at least once. Otherwise, it follows the existing New Start application process and timeline. Our thoughts would be that the replication application and the grading rubric would be simpler than the existing New Start application, but some of the feedback we're looking from you all on is kind of what information will we still need from an operator that we're familiar with in this replication process to give you enough information to make those decisions. One tweak that we did make after our March meeting and discussion on this legislation was adding specific rulemaking authorities for this pathway. Since it's brand new, we wanted to give you all a little flexibility on how to lay out this application pathway and kind of what it will look like moving forward. So that's kind of those are the 5 main areas that this bill made changes to. I'm happy to take any additional questions at this point.
Hayden, could I ask a question?
Yep.
Am I correct that the term replication's a little bit vague here and something we need to talk about? Like, do they have to be truly replicating their exact model, or can it just be an operator that's opening a new school that's similar but might be different grade levels? Is that something we need to talk about, flesh out a little bit?
Yes, I think that's something we wanted to discuss fully with y'all. The law says that it mentions specifically the same academic focus. While that's a little vague, I think the way we've interpreted it and the way that the legislature discussed it as it was moving through was the idea that would be that the school would take its existing model, something that we're familiar with, and essentially create that new school in a different location within the same district. In terms of grade bands, things like that, I think that's up for discussion, and part of the reason we added in this rulemaking authority for you all is to kind of define, what we're interpreting academic focus to mean, what the intention of what we'll be looking for in these applications, since it will be a simplified application process, and what, kind of where y'all's heads are at in terms of decision making for this pathway.
So I'm assuming here, Hayden, that if in second bullet, applications made to the local LEA, they turn it down, then the appeal process that we have today would go into effect, correct?
I believe so. I would have to look back at the chapter exactly, but these would still be open for direct application to us, and then I believe there's still that appeal right. And Ashley, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe they'd still be able to appeal if a replication was denied.
If it was denied by another LEA, that's correct.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So to follow up on Lauren's question, because I think she started peeling back a very interesting question. Charter School A applies to the LEA, denied, comes to us, we overturn. Let's just assume that they've been able to open. their academic focus is K through 8. In school A, though, they said, hey, we're going to do K1, K and 1 this first year, and then we're going to add in 2, 3, they're going to keep growing. Their replication could be, hey, we're still doing K8, but we're going to open all grades at the same time. I think that's where we're going to have to really look at some of those rules to make sure that our intent is that you're following the exact same kind of replication model and not saying, well, just because you did K8, but you're doing a staggered, you can do K8, but you're just going to open full bore somewhere else. Because I have some concerns, honestly, with this of just being open 1 year. By the time we go through the process, we don't even have great data on how they're actually performing long term in their metrics before moving forward. So I think this is where I get to go and say, thank goodness I'm not part of the rules committee, and this is where Terrence and his team get to, geek out and have fun, and then just listen to all of us opine once they actually do all the hard work. So I think it's one of those things that we're really going to have to look at, because I think Lauren's question started opening up some possibilities that we really need to think through going forward.
Yeah, well, Eddie, I think what I was thinking specifically about is like, say you have an elementary classical school that then comes to us to open a classical high school. Like, that's just a very different, it's the same academic focus, but running a high school versus elementary is very different. So like, is that considered replication? Would we take that? Or is that something it sounds like it's up to us to decide if that would be an application we would consider, right?
Yeah, I think that's part of the discussion that we're going to have today when we get into what is what becomes a rule, what becomes a policy, and part of the conversation we want to hear from you all as far as what we need to really define for any application we might receive.
Yes.
Well, although it might be less likely, I think we also need to think not only about how we might have people who want to replicate because they currently have a that is operating under our service as the LEA, but there are two other might be some folks who want to leave us and go with a district that is their local LEA. And we ought to have at least what would be the parameters we would want to see if someone's leaving, because we don't want them just to, out the door, and we don't know that the kids who are there will be adequately provided for. And then the other thing is that we may have folks who are operating a school and it isn't a New Start charter that they want to replicate. They want to bring one of their existing schools over. And I don't know how that's going to work. So we've got a couple scenarios here to think about, and good luck to the rules committee.
Just a follow-up question on that. Is that allowed? Like, if they're up for renewal, they can come to us? Is that accurate?
No, I'm not thinking about if they're up for
renewal.
they could come, they might be able to, I think they have to go through the process of being turned down and then come to us. Although you might be right. Maybe they can come to us directly. Who knows? We'll have to see how this works.
The renewal appeal process did not change. So they would still be up for renewal under their existing authorizer, and then if they're denied there, they could still appeal it as through that process that exists today. This didn't touch that, other than giving y'all flexibility on the term lengths. So this replication pathway is entirely new and separate from any of our existing processes.
All right. So question then, Hayden, and I'm going to now actually going to crawl under the table with this question. Does replication mean new? It's not a new start, because that was the first school. So under replication, do we have the option of just a 5-year term under that? Because technically replication is not a new start charter. It's a replication.
Right. This would still, the only piece that 5 to 10 year term length applies to is a renewal appeal. So that would be a school that was up for renewal at the local level. was denied and then comes in appeals to the commission. So replication term lengths would be 10 years as required by the law. The only thing that flexible term length applies to is renewal appeals.
And Eddie, the language of the statute says that if they are triggered by replication, they follow the New Start process. So that is laid out in the law that they have to follow that process. And New Start is a 10-year charter term.
Yes,
Okay.
it follows the same timeline and application process as New Starts, except replications will have a separate application that will be developing with the State Board of Education, but otherwise follows the existing timeline for New Start applications. All right.
Okay. Let's keep going.
All right, if there's nothing else, I'll pass it on to Beth for her section next.
Thank you, Hayden. So as Hayden mentioned, I'm going to now go ahead and talk through the application process and what it would look like if we were to receive an application directly. As Tess started out the meeting, some of you who have gone through this process before on appeals, you will find that as I go through the slides, you will see some similarities to the appeal process, but today's focus is specifically on what it would look like for us to review an initial and amended application when the sponsor applies directly to the commission. And then at our July meeting, we'll dive into more details specific to the appeals process. And so as we've been discussing, direct application to the commission is now possible under specific circumstances, beginning with the 25-26 cycle. And so today we're focusing on the specific portion of TCA that lays out the timeline for the New Start application process, which applies to all authorizers, not just the commission. These are the rules that all authorizers are adhering to. It is important to note here that all authorizers statewide utilize the same application and scoring rubric, and the responsibility for the creation of the application as well as that scoring rubric will now fall with the State Board of Education. So as we dive through all the different areas and components of what the New Start process would look like, I wanted to look holistically at what the application process looks like, kind of from start to finish. And that way you can visualize what that looks like. And so the journey of a New Start application begins December 3rd with the applicant filing that letter of intent with the authorizer. So us as a commission, beginning December 3rd, 2025, we could potentially see letters of intent coming to us to apply directly to us. When an authorizer receives that letter of intent, the sponsor can then submit an application by February 1st, and the authorizer has 90 days to review and vote on that initial application. And then in instances where an application is denied, the applicant can submit an amended application within 30 days. And then upon receipt of an amended application, an authorizer has 60 days to vote on that application. Thank you. And so now I want to ground us in what the standard of review looks like when we're looking at an initial and amended application. And so State Board and statute sets out the broad timelines and expectations for any authorizer that receives a New Start application. It's important to note here, we spend a lot of time regularly when we talk about this process, that it's important that we're adhering to State Board of Education's quality authorizing standards when reviewing any New Start application, whether it be going through the initial and amended application or an appeal. And so the standards that the State Board lays out for us, it includes all of the best practices that an authorizer should follow when conducting the review. That includes components such as the use of a review committee, a capacity interview. All of those items go into the review of a New Start application. Also, when considering standard of review, key criteria when looking at and evaluating a New Start application will include, there's a full list of things, but we're looking at the capacity of the applicant, their quality of their educational program, whether or not they have effective governance and management. All of those items apply when reviewing the initial and amended application. The applications must meet or exceed standard on the State Board of Education scoring rubric to be recommended for approval. That's all language we're familiar with. And then an authorizer must provide sponsors with written reasons for any denial. So the process commences with the notice of intent, which, as I mentioned, could come as early as December 3rd of 2025. And that is submitted to an authorizer 60 days prior to the application. So essentially, the notice of intent is the sponsor telling the authorizer, hey, I may be submitting an application by February 1. So then by February 1, authorizers receive an application for the year preceding the school's proposed opening. The required materials at the time of submission will encompass all the documents that are included within the application. And so depending on what type of applicant they are, the application itself will specify what types of application materials are required. So it will always include an application narrative, but required attachments, applicable addenda, operating budget. Those are all of the items that will be reviewed in both the initial application review as well as the amended application review. And then upon submission, authorizers will confirm receipt and they'll notify sponsors if there are any incomplete items submitted. So now transitioning us to talk through the work of the review committee. So those of you that are familiar with the appeals process, the review of a new start application process also will include the engagement and use of a review committee. The committee is comprised of both internal as well as external experts with diverse backgrounds. We're looking for individuals with experience in academics, operations, finance, legal, etc. We want to make sure that the committee is comprised of individuals that are free of conflict of interest. They will receive training as a part of being a part of the review committee, and they will be trained on how to utilize the scoring rubric and assess that application based on the established criteria. Additionally, the review committee is responsible for evaluating the application based on the State Board of Education's rubric. They're responsible for conducting a capacity interview with the proposed school leader and the governing board, as well as they will work to develop a consensus rating for each application section. And as I mentioned, an application must meet or exceed standards in all sections for recommendation of approval by the review committee. So once the review committee completes their work and staff has conducted their due diligence, a recommendation is made on the initial application. If an initial application is denied, an authorizer must provide the sponsor with a written explanation of the reasons for denial. So this comes up regularly as governing bodies are voting on initial applications, that it's really important that as a governing body, it is essential to be clear about any specific reasons for denial. And the reason we want to be very clear on what the reasons for denial are is it ensures transparency, but also provides applicants with clear, actionable feedback on areas that they can improve upon. And then now walking us through an amended application. So a sponsor would only be submitting an amended application if that initial application is denied. And so if that initial application is denied, the sponsor will have 30 days from the receipt of that denial to submit an amended application. So during that 30-day period, the sponsor is updating their applications and addressing any identified deficiencies. They may use track changes, some type of method to ensure that we can see how they, as an applicant, resolved the deficiencies that were identified in the reason for denial. And this particular portion of the process, just to note, does not require a capacity interview. And then walking us through that final step of these applications, once an amended application is received, an authorizer has 60 days to review that amended application and begin working on an updated recommendation. In the case of an application to the commission's decision on an amended application is final and it's not subject to an appeal. For applications, however, that are submitted to an LEA, the sponsor does maintain the option to appeal the denial to the commission. And I just want to mention here that one thing that we haven't talked about yet as a part of this process is that this new direct application process is going to transition immediately into our appeal season. And so I just want to name the fact that we are currently looking at our staffing capacity to make sure that we have appropriate staffing to basically run this process from starting December all the way through October. And so if this is exciting, but it's also going to be a lot of work. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
All right, so Beth, I understand all of this. as it currently stands. But now let's go and look at LEA that has denied something 3 times. So now they can direct apply to us. As I look at TCA code, as it applies to the LEA, what will our workflow look like if we deny initially? How do they submit an amended application if our decision is final? Because they still have the amendment window under TCA to submit, and then we have 60 days to review the amended application.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding the question. Ashley, did you?
Eddie, what I heard you mention, I think we're talking about 2 different things. If the commission overturns 3 amended application decisions, a sponsor in that district can apply directly to us. They too would have to follow this same New Start process. They just submitted the application to us. So the timeline Beth just went over is the same. It's just a direct application to the commission, if I'm understanding what you asked correctly.
Except our decision. So go back to the timeline for a second. So let me walk you through the timeline if we can. So imagine that we've already gone through the whole process. Now they're directly applying to us. So letter of intent sent to us, initial application submitted February 1st. Within 90 days, we take a vote. Our decision there is final. There is no pathway for an amendment because our decision is final. So we're going to have to figure out how, because it says in the statute that our decision is final and cannot be appealed. So how do we go about doing the application?
They would still have the opportunity if they apply directly to the commission, they would still have the opportunity to amend their application once they receive a decision on their initial application. There's still that amendment option.
They can appeal. They cannot appeal the final amended application decision, but they still have the opportunity to submit an initial application and correct any deficiencies and submit an amended application. That timeline still applies. What decision we make at the end of the amended application would be final.
Okay, that's not quite how I read TCA in the process of our authority. So that's where I want to make sure that we've really got some very clear things, because as I look at TCA, we're doing a de novo review right now on appeals, but there's no way for anybody to actually, there's no appeal process past us. Whatever we decide on that first vote becomes the final action of the commission. There would almost have to be an interim. We would almost have to create an interim vote to allow for.
And are you thinking about are you thinking about a school that is one of the ones that we overturned? Or I guess I'm getting confused as to where you're seeing that we're going to need another decision.
So I'm looking at it from I'm going to pick on Fulton County, Georgia. So I'm not picking on one of ours. Fulton County, Georgia denies 3 charter New Starts. Now every charter school can direct apply to us. They don't have to go through that local. This is the local process before it gets to us. We now become the local process. So our vote, now that we are taking the place of that local LEA, that middle dot, the vote on the initial application, our votes are final, cannot be appealed. There is no amendment process within the current code to allow for this. So this is where I want to make sure that we've at least come up with some rules, because if you look at the TCA, it clearly states that our decisions are final and cannot be appealed. They would be appealing to us,
but
which is
again,
not allowed.
that's on the amended application. So if we have overturned 3 times, let's say in October, that 2 months later in December, those sponsors can apply directly to us, and then they have to follow this exact timeline that Beth has laid out with the initial and amended application. They have to follow TCA 108, I believe is the statute.
Yes.
Right, an amended application cannot be appealed to us. If we've denied an amended application, that cannot be appealed to us.
And Eddie, I didn't mention it specifically in my presentation, but the new bill this year adds a specific in laying out the timeline for this specific thing, where if we've overturned a district 3 times in 3 years, it still includes the language to allow for the submission of amended applications. That added in a new piece to this. Our final decision on the amended application is final and may not be appealed, but it still adds in the whole amended application submission and y'all's second round of review.
Okay. And that's what I'm
Yes.
missing, because I'm looking at TCA as it stands today, and I can't read that. I can't read what you all are saying into the current code because
Okay.
it doesn't give us that authorization. So
Okay.
again,
So
I'm
we can
trying to
send
look
you
at,
the new section, the 137 section. Yes.
I'm trying to make sure everything matches up so that we don't get ourselves in trouble with
Right.
some rule that is, or what we need to really be thinking about.
Absolutely.
Sorry about the tangent there, Tess and Chris. I know y'all are like,
No,
somebody
that's all
please
right.
mute his
But that's why we're having this open and robust discussion.
So I think actually we're gonna get to the rules and policy discussion next, which we may have already covered some of the topics. So I'm gonna turn it over to Ashley to talk about this final section.
Yes. So to continue this conversation, I think first thing I want to do is sort of level set the difference in the rules and the policies. So Pam, if you want to go to that first slide for me, please. So rules will set out the clear instructions. It will set out the acts that have to be performed. Think application fees, application dates, how we determine a complete application, and the actual process. So it will be a lot of what Beth sort of went over that will be set forth in our rule. For policies, we kind of look at this as guidance for the decision makers. This will speak to commission specific applicants. It will be broader in scope. And I think the biggest thing for the commission to understand is this is more adaptable year over year. After we go through a cycle and we see where changes need to be made, it's easier to put that in a policy than a rule, because it is a long process, as you'll see in this next slide, to get a rule changed. So now I want to go over what the timeline is going to look like for you all in the next couple of meetings that we have. So in July, you're going to see a lot of documentation from commission staff. There will be 2 sets of rules that come forth. The content will be the same, but it will be necessary to run 2 rule processes. First, we will do emergency rules. They will require legal reasoning. And I'll tell you now, the legal reasoning is that this process will affect us immediately July 1. And so we need to have rules in place. So that will be up for first and final reading next month. We will send that to the Attorney General's office to review for constitutionality. And emergency rules are effective for 180 days. So that will be from August until January of next year. And that will give us time to run the permanent rules process, which takes a little bit more time. There will be 2 readings for the permanent rules, July and October. In between July and October, staff will conduct a rulemaking hearing, and that is where we will get feedback from the public. I will present that to you all at the October meeting. We can decide if we make any changes based on that, and then that will go forward to be our permanent rule. As you can see, this is a very long process. Like I said, we have to have a rulemaking hearing around it. And so that's why we will be running rules and policies as well as the emergency rules at the same time. And then finally, we will also be running commission policies. We will do that in 2 readings. Again, this will be commission specific considerations. And again, it's easier to revise these through commission action versus having to go through the rulemaking process. So there are a couple of things that the staff has already considered. And if you all have any initial feedback, of course, please let me know. First, as far as the application fee, there's a statutory maximum that authorizers can charge of $2,500 per initial application. Our suggestion is to use that $2,500. It matches what we did for the ASD applications. It matches what other LEAs do across the state. I think it covers the workload that you all have seen that goes into reviewing these applications. We recommend notifying the local board when we receive a replication application, conducting a capacity interview during the initial application phase. And then we think a public meeting is always important. We would want to do that during the initial application phase, and again, providing notice to that local board. And then it will be important to track any changes between that initial and amended application to sort of streamline what you're looking at, but then to know what changes were made between initial and amended before you make a decision on that amended application, because again, that decision is final. So here are the big questions that we still have. And please, let us know your feedback. And I will say at the outset, whatever discussion we have, what we come to you with in July will reflect either in rule or policy this discussion. So first, I know we talked about it a little earlier in the presentation, is that definition of academic focus. As we stated, the statute does say, I'm just going to read from the statute, a governing body that has at least one public charter school authorized by a local board of education or by the commission that has been in operation for at least one full school year can submit an application for replication where they are currently operating, and they have to have the same academic focus. Staff conversation has been that academic focus is what you are currently operating. What have you successfully operated for a year? You have successfully operated a K-5, you would be replicating a K-5. And so that is where we're thinking, but I'll pause here to see if commissioners have any feedback there.
Well, I think Commissioner Smith already made comments in this area, and I agree with his comments. The replication is a little, if it varies from what they're currently doing, it seems to me to be risky. And also if there's a difference between the grades they're operating and what they're proposing, that seems to be adding an element of risk. So I agree with his comments.
Okay. Any other thoughts before I move on?
I guess I'm kind of wondering the intent of the law. Is it just to allow the exact models to replicate, or is it to allow great CMOs to open more schools through a different pathway? Because if it's that, then I could see if we have a really excellent operator who has a proven, operates 5 grade schools and wants to open another one that is maybe a little bit different. I mean, I personally would be excited to see that application come to us, but I'm curious to hear others. Yeah. Is that outside of what we're thinking about?
I'll throw it to Hayden for the legislative discussion around it, but I will just say that I think part of your question, Lauren, is something that the commission has to decide what that means for them in a replication application.
Right. And I think kind of as the law was moving through, most of the discussion focused on, well, almost taking the word replication literally, in terms of, well, you've got a great school here, why don't we just open another one over here and doing the exact same thing? But I think they also left it a little open-ended so that if you all see an application that, well, maybe it's not the exact same, but it's pretty close, same operator, you're familiar and comfortable with them, you would still have the authority to say, well, okay, well, so they've tweaked a couple things. I mean, it doesn't specify in the law. It just uses that term academic focus. I think leaves it up to your all's judgment a bit in terms of what exactly that means.
Right, and I think that is evident in the law as well, Lauren. Just because what's evident, I would say to me, is you all making that decision because they left it at operation for at least one full school year. So do you trust an operator that's only been operating for a year? They were approved for K-5 and then they come to you in a year and say they want to open a high school. Is that a school that you trust to replicate if they only have 1 year of data? So I think those are the types of things that they're looking for the commission to consider.
Yeah.
I would also say, I think given the fact that academic focus is defined, they need to explain how their academic focus, it is replication. To me, it would be a very hard sell to say, I currently only operate K-8s, but my academic focus is the same for a high school, because we know that is not true. And there are mechanisms within the law currently to add grades, add height, like amendment petitions, etc. And so that would be, my recommendation would be to say academic focus you need to describe to me how is this a replication of your current academic focus.
So can I, and I know I'm about to ask for something a little difficult, Hayden. I would love to, if you could somehow pull some of the clips of the discussion from the winning side of this. Obviously, there's two sides to every bit of this, because the winning side is the one that is following that's what the courts would look at for legislative intent, because I would love to see what were they really thinking around that, so that it can kind of help define whether that should be, we can really write that in as, per legislative intent and the discussion to really give some clarity around that, because I agree. I mean, I think if they were thinking school A has been doing really well in their K through 5, and they've been in operation for, I'm going to guess they were assuming they'd been in operation for several years. We want to replicate that and open somewhere else. I have no problem with that. But if they're been open for 1 year, they're K through 5, but they've only got K1 and 2 right now, and they want to replicate and do all 5 grades, I now have concern, even though they may be replicating what they're doing, they're not replicating the activities that they've currently been doing. And that's the model is replicated, the activity is not. That's where I'm kind of trying to define a little bit around replication here, just because I think replication can mean 2 different things. And I just want to make sure we're looking at it from that holistic standpoint.
So Ashley, let me ask you this hypothetical. So let's say we've got a school system that is set up where their schools serve geographic areas, not broadly. And we get a replication request that is outside of that geographic area. How would we handle that? Second question, let's look at that school district that says, okay, you got a replication. How do we know the potential financial impact it's going to have on the school system if we decide that we're going to approve a replication? Because we know we've dealt with that, we've had to look at it. Are we going to be able to have access to that information so we can determine if school X is K to 5 and they want to replicate and then go to high school? How do we make sure that the financial burden, the issue is not going to come back to us from the school system saying we don't really need that? So, I mean, how do we get those kind of things built into when we're looking at replication? Because we, again, as a commission, we've had to deal with some of these questions on appeals. And then I've got a second one real quick as you're going through here. I would sure like to see the process used now by LEAs to approve this, and then put it next to what we're proposing, so we can see, are our provisions, like for example, your public meeting coming up, are we asking to do things that if you went through an LEA, they do not ask for, or are there things an LEA asks for that we're not going to put in when we're looking at this kind of a question? You understand what I'm asking?
I do.
Okay.
So I will say the statute limits where you can replicate has to be in the LEA in which the governing body is currently operating. That is the only way that you can submit a replication application. So I think that answers the very first question you asked, Tom. The additional questions, I would say that is what we can build into our rules and policy. We have a bit more latitude in this process than we do appeals, to do more due diligence as far as what I think you're getting at is the fiscal impact of replicating in the LEA. And so I think that because we have that latitude, we'll be able to get that information, or at least request it and have that for the commission's consideration.
Yeah, and thank you. And one other point real quick. I would like for us to see what a new start, say, and let me just say, going into Metro Nashville, what the things that they have to do. I'd like to look at then what we're looking at and to sort of see, are we asking to do same things, different things, or whatever, just so we've got some sense of a school that comes through the way they do today. Are they doing the same things? Are we asking the same things? Are we asking more? Or are we asking less? And it's just for comparative. I just would like to see, because it gives us a chance to look at the overall process now, because we're getting ready to create a process.
Absolutely. We can have that ready for you all next month as part of your materials.
And then looking at your second bullet point there,
Yes.
Ashley, the public meeting.
Mhm.
One of the things that I think that all of you all have done extremely well up to this point is how we conduct our public meetings. As I look at it now from a replication standpoint, so if current school with us wants to replicate, it doesn't go through the local LEA. How do we go about making sure that if an LEA is going to show up at a public hearing, that there is a clear method for them to not just state something, but they have to actually submit some documentation to back up the claims they're making? That way, because Tess has done an excellent job taking all of that information, pulling the data, and then really kind of laying it out in her explanation to either support or refute those claims. But we want to make sure that what they're telling us is something that Tess has physical things to actually either affirm or refute in her recommendation. Now, how much does her recommendation weigh? I mean, honestly, I don't want to give it a specific percentage. It weighs into it, but it weighs into it because I look at it last, because I've gone through everything else to come up to my own conclusion. Does my conclusion match what her conclusion is? And was there something I missed or not? So I think it's extremely helpful when we look at it, because it gives some clarity, especially around the public hearings of things that were stated, where she's done some research that I might not necessarily be able to do just based on my limited knowledge. So that's where my thought process is around the second bullet point there.
Yeah, and I will say, Eddie, on the staff side, we agree with you. We think the public meeting is very important. As Beth mentioned, we our intention is to include that in the initial application review. We're going to provide that local board notice that we're having that public hearing. I think it differs from appeals in that they don't necessarily have an obligation to appear. But I do hear your question of having them provide documentation to support whatever comment they want to give. I think, again, like I said, we do not have to give them necessarily the floor to speak to it. They are a member of the public for all intents and purposes in this particular public meeting. But if that is something the commission wants to consider of holding time or space for the local board, and if they choose to take us up on that offer, they have to have supporting documentation. I'm spitballing here. That could be an option, but like I said, there's no obligation for them because this is our process, is what I would say in response to that.
Yeah, and again, I think where my thought process is, and I'm not articulating it very well, not had enough coffee yet this morning, obviously, is, what some of the key factors, is this in the best interest of the students? Is it, does it harm, the LEA from a financial capacity? Those things that are kind of in statute that we have to take into account is really what I'm looking at more for that evidence that they have to provide, rather than just giving them the floor for bashing us or bashing the process or not liking something. Like, okay, you can submit that. Anybody can give public comment to that. But if you're going to stand up, if the LEA is going to stand up to make a case against something that could be detrimental, you've got to provide us with some proof, not just words. That's where my mind is kind of going.
And I may be misunderstanding Eddie, but I think I'm agreeing here. Obviously, this is a conversation about how to translate the law into our regulations, but the fundamental, the underlying prospect of charter schools is it brings innovation and new ideas to education. And I worry a little bit about, I hate to use the word over-regulating, but I want to make sure that we don't put things in place that make it so burdensome that we stifle innovation with teaching these students. And I don't know exactly how to, or I need to think more about how to better articulate that. But a lot of the conversation here is around all the things that we got to put in place to make sure that people check the proper boxes before we go forward with something. But by definition, some of the innovation models may be things that are new and can't necessarily check those boxes. Does that, I mean, Eddie, I mean, is that kind of what you're saying?
I agree with you there. I'm not looking for necessarily the authorizer to submit this. This is when people are going to speak in public comment, when we have public comment on a replication model or a new start that's directly appealing to us. And the LEA is saying, well, we don't, you know, even though they can directly apply to you, we believe this is going to harm our district from a financial standpoint, but then they provide nothing else. Well, no, if you're going to make that statement, you need to have some data to back that up for us to either affirm or refute that as we're thinking through it, because we still have to take best interest of the students, the LEA, you know, the financial capacity, all of those things into account.
I misunderstood, Jetty. I thought you were putting that on the applicant, not the school. Okay, I got you. Thank you. I misunderstood you.
Alan, let me make one point, which is I would hope, and my question earlier is that we've done enough now, our team has, in looking at appeals and what applicants have to go through, that we're able to provide maybe a way to go at this that's much more forward-thinking, not as burdensome. Because one of the things we talked about as a commission, you all remember this, is when we were doing our reviews of our current schools, is saying, can we do things that make it less burdensome so that they have the ability to do what you're talking about? And I think Tess and the team have taken steps so that our reviews and follow-ups are not viewed as, oh my gosh, here we come again. We're always, it sort of slows down what we're trying to do. That's what I hope that we look at. We've done enough of these to know what really is effective and what things are just there to jump hurdles. And I hope we don't do things just to jump hurdles. I don't think we will.
No, and Tom, to back up, the reason why I'm bringing this up is, think back, if you all will. I want to say it was a cycle ago, maybe two. I'm losing track of time, to be honest with you. When I made a comment that, if you're going to speak so harshly, they needed to be there in person, and we got some pushback that they didn't know they could be there in person. I want to make sure that we've thought through all the processes of how someone opposing, an LEA that doesn't like something, has every avenue to make sure they've given us all the information in a way so that they can't say, well, we didn't know, or you didn't give us this, because again, I think it's important that we have all information, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be the single sole factor in this. So I'm just thinking through some of the things we've seen, as Tom said, over the years, to make sure that we're thinking through. You can stand up in a public meeting and say something that might become the narrative, but then you can't back it up with data and facts, and we can't really refute that. That's where I'm looking to make sure that we just don't have wild narratives running as we go through this process, because it's kind of new for all of us, and I'm just trying to think through the possible ramifications.
So I did want to add to Tom's point around kind of what are the expectations of all authorizers versus what we might be expecting. And so everything we've talked about thus far would be an expectation of all authorizers, hosting a capacity interview, providing feedback. One thing that is not required is the public meeting. And I think we have to do a public hearing in an appeal, but we are not required to do it a public meeting in this process. However, we have found a lot of value in being in the community, hearing from the community, transparency around our process. And so I think we are recommending that we do some sort of public meeting in the school district in which a school is applying. It may look a little different than our traditional appeal hearing, but because we value that part of a process. But I want to name that is not a requirement of statute. That is not a requirement of other authorizers. And so a sponsor who does apply directly to the commission, that would be an additional expectation. So I would kind of just want to name that, and also get affirmation from you all that us including some level of a public meeting in which we can hear from the community is a valuable part of the process that we would want to include in a traditional New Start not the appeal that we already have to do.
Okay, so Tess, let me ask this question. There was a bill this year, and I don't know how it affects public hearings so step aside. It did not go through the appeals process. They're direct applying to us. We are now the LEA. So we meet on a quarterly basis. We have public comment at our meetings. We're actually saying we're creating this public comment section separate from our meetings to hear from a greater segment of the population, because our public comment hearing is limited to 30 minutes for everything before us for the day, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so how does the new law that went into effect that allows for public comment affect our 30-minute rule? Was it 30 minutes per topic, that's going to be? So like if we're doing a new start, there's 30 minutes for each one of those, or is it 30 minutes total? That's one of the things that the legislature did this year around some of the public comments that now that we're thinking through all this, like how does that go into play? And with this, what you're proposing, which I agree with, having these public meetings, does that take the place of and suffice that new state law?
I think that other bill, Eddie, only dealt with local bodies. I don't think that it applied. I'll have to go back and look at it specifically, but I think that dealt with local, but municipal and county level bodies. So it wouldn't apply to the commission. I'll have to double check on that for you. But to my knowledge, it wouldn't apply to any of our meetings because we're not underneath the same code section as the bodies that did apply to.
I thought it applied to LEAs, which we are an LEA.
Well, I'll have to defer to Ashley a bit, but I don't think we necessarily fall under the exact same LEA considerations as all other LEAs for the purposes of that.
And I'll have to look at the language of that statute again, Eddie. I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me right now.
And that's fine. I didn't think you would. I'm just thinking through all the different aspects that we really need to be thinking through for that July meeting. Because there was a lot that happened this year, especially around some of these things that are affecting how it all interplays.
Are there any other thoughts on?
Let you all go.
No, that's fine. Are there any other thoughts on the public meeting and keeping this? And again, as Tess mentioned, our recommendation is to keep it. We found a lot of value in it, but it is not required as part of this new start process.
I think the sense of it is that the commission would like to see it incorporated in our process.
Yes, and that's fine. And like I said, we do have 2 readings on permanent rules, and so if there's a change there, and we put this in a rule, we can always revisit this at our October meeting.
Mm-hmm. The other thing I think, as you think about the way you're going to prepare these rules for us to consider in July, this first bullet point on definition of academic focus, you might want to write that in such a way that it is relatively strict on the way we will consider what constitutes replication of academic focus and approved grade structure, but then write a section that allows for there to be exceptions upon a showing of circumstances that warrant the exception, to try to build into this idea that if we have a great operator who comes in and wants to replicate and is doing something just a little outside what they're currently doing, we want to allow some flexibility. And let's look at a rule that looks like that. We can always come back and say, no, we just strict more statutorily language driven rule. But I think it'd be good to take a look at it where we also specifically provide for some flexibility. And then we can continue this discussion then in July.
Okay.
Chris, I like that idea a lot. And I was just going to say, what we don't want to do is waste CMO's time. Like, if it's something that we're not going to consider, how can we, maybe they could make a case if this is a little bit of an exception, we could look at it and decide if it's something we would even consider and let them know before they go through the whole, I would just hate for someone to go through the whole process and then us say, this is too outside the scope, you know?
Yeah,
So-
it's going to be that drafting of the exception language is going to be, where the rubber's going to meet the road on this thing. I mean, it's easy to take the extreme example, somebody who's been operating they were authorized for K through 5 and they've been operating K and K1 for a year and they come in and want a high school. I mean, that side of the extreme is pretty easy to say, no, we're not even going to play in that game. But I am concerned with this, if they're relatively small things that people want to make changes about, particularly since they may be changing their first school or their first schools to make that change. If they come in and say, well, we've been doing this, but now we want to do this plus this, and this, and we want our replicated school to do this plus this. In that kind of case, we're probably going to be wanting to hear more about it. So let's give it a go at least looking at it, and we'll see where we end up.
Okay. And then the last point here, because the way the language triggers, we could receive replication applications from operators or sponsors that we have never seen before. And the first time we see them will be on this initial application. And so the staff is wondering, what do you all want to see? What do you all want to consider in reviewing applications that have not been authorized by the commission that we have never seen before? Like I said, since this will be the first time we're looking at anything that they've submitted.
Anybody have any comments?
Yeah, Commissioner Richard, can you hear me okay? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I do think because we have had such a strong process since our inception, it would make sense for us to follow the materials that we generally have received on first look with our historical process. So for me, that it would seem that, and I feel the same way with respect to the public meeting process and even the definition of academic focus. We have done such a consistent, thorough job since inception. As much as we can transfer our historical processes and policies in this new context, I think it would just be really helpful because of our track record. So in this instance, I would say, as long as we get the information that we've historically received when we've looked at applications on first look.
Thank you for that.
Other comments on this?
Yeah, this was part of my reason for raising earlier. I'd like to see what is being asked that we do not ask, or just so we've got that comparative. That was the side-by-side, Ashley, I was talking about when I saw this last piece. Just so we know, well, I'm not sure we need, I'm not sure that helps us, or maybe there's something that would be helpful that's not being asked, when they first come to us. So that was the reason for my question.
Right. And I think where the staff was coming from, where we were coming from when we came up with this particular question, as we know in appeals, we are very, we're bound by statute in what we can ask for and what we can look at and what constitutes the record on an appeal. In an application consideration, we have a little bit more latitude. And so we just wanted to give you all the opportunity to let us know if there were items or evidence that maybe you thought would be important if you received an application from a sponsor that you had no knowledge of, that had never been before the commission in any capacity. So that's where that question was coming from. But as I stated, Tom, we can get that side by side for you for your July materials. And I've taken note, Terrence, of what you mentioned about the historical items as well. Okay, Pam, if we want to go to the next slide. So now I just want to recap our next steps, and then I'll turn it back over to Beth. So we're going to use the information from this conversation today, and we'll prepare those documents that I mentioned, the rules and policies. And at our July meeting, we're going to have for your consideration the emergency rules on first and final reading, We're going to have the permanent rules on first reading and then policy on first reading. We're going to continue to engage with our stakeholders between first and final. That will be reflected in our rulemaking hearing and what comes before you in October. And we're also developing an FAQ to inform the stakeholders on key information related to this process. So if you had any other thoughts about what needs to be incorporated in those documents, of course, we'll take those. If not, I will pass it back over to Beth to talk about the final items.
Thank you,
Now,
Ashley.
the only comment that I have before Beth gets started is, folks, we're going to have time in our meetings, both July and October, to deal with this. And just a reminder, our October meeting is where we end up doing a lot of our reviews in our normal process. So I will try to build the schedule to be as efficient as possible, but we're going to have time to work on these. Hopefully we can do a lot of the heavy lifting in July where we don't have an appeals process underway, but just a heads up, because these meetings just may have to be a little bit longer.
And then lastly, as we close, I just wanted to provide you all with one other update. I know we spent a lot of time having a great discussion about this new process for the commission, but as we know, New Start appeals are quickly becoming our reality. And so at this time, MMPS did vote on amended applications in June rather than July. And so that does mean that we are actually starting our appeal process as of today. And so we will need to have a special called meeting in late August or early September to handle these MMPS appeals. And so please be on the lookout for a poll of your availability so that way we can identify a date for the special called meeting. And then we will be providing more logistical information and specifics as we get those meeting dates set up and in concrete. And we will also be posting the information about the special called meeting in the future on our website. But we wanted to make you all aware of it while we have you all here, that we will be handling appeals kind of in two separate batches. The first being the MMPS applications late August, early September, and then the remainder at our October meeting.
Okay, are there other comments or questions on any part of this presentation or information, or anybody have any thoughts on things that maybe we should be considering that aren't included in this presentation? Okay, hearing none. Is there any other questions, anything about, the special process we're having to go through with the change of the timing with MMPS, or anything else?
So I think my only question is, and I know I emailed Tess to ask you all this. The only question around the MMPS, does the new law state that if a district denies whatever the date the district denies, or is it our final action? So like, if it doesn't matter that they denied all these in June, our actions happen in August, September, that starts the clock then, not the district's denial timeline, correct?
That's correct. It's
Okay.
a denial after July 1st.
The district denial after July 1st, or
The commission overturn, I'm sorry.
okay,
If the commission overturns after July 1st, that counts towards the 3 denials in 3 years.
okay, thank you.
Okay, other questions? Well, hearing none, in closing, I want to thank our staff for putting all this together, and to our commissioners for the thoughtful discussion on the new law and impacts to the future of this commission and the students we serve. If there are no further comments, I'm going to look and see if anybody's waving at me, but I don't see anybody waving at me. Okay, then we're going to adjourn this meeting. Thank you all for your time. Try to stay cool in this hot weather, and we will look to hearing from you in July. Seeing you. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.